Okay. Good, almost afternoon. How's everybody? Good? Good. Um, my name is Josh Katz. I'm a partner at McKinsey, and thank you all for joining us here. I have to say, hopefully you all can't hear that as clearly as I can. Louder. All right. That's good? All right. So thank you all for joining us. I think we're going to spend an hour together. Very excited about the conversation we're going to have. What we'll do is I'll spend a few minutes. There's two topics really that we wanted to cover today that I hope are of interest. One is if we think about addressing the nature crisis, what can companies do? And the second is how are governments acting and what's some of the great progress that we're seeing? Because we're going to need civil society, we're going to need corporate action, we're going to need investors. We all need to put our hands together to solve this. And so what we've been working on and what we wanted to share with you for the first time today is how we can achieve some of those goals. So let me start here on companies. So first, I think what you'll see is we've worked for a long time on climate. Climate has been the kind of preeminent one of what I would say the planetary boundaries that we've all been thinking about. And we've made some good progress. We have targets, we have a clear metric, we have actions that people are taking. We have a global target, right? We have the 1.5 degree pathway, we have the 2 degree agreement in Paris. Unfortunately, in nature, we're not quite there yet. And so as we thought about this, we said, well, we have the startings of that, which we'll talk about in terms of planetary boundaries. But what we haven't solved yet is how exactly are we going to get there? And what actions can corporates take? And so that's what we've been focused on. And for those that aren't familiar with the planetary boundaries, I am not going to do a science lecture, as much as I might like to. But this is the idea that there are 9 systems that are linked on this planet, that if we are out of balance in any of them, this does not become a particularly good planet to support our lives and livelihoods. And this is from the Stockholm Resource Center and Johan Rockström. There's actually a pretty good Netflix documentary about it. But as we kind of searched through the scientific literature and said, what can we anchor people on to try to solve this crisis? What is the best framework out there? And this is where we landed. And what you'll see is the good news is we have a view on several of those planetary boundaries. The bad news is we don't have a view on all of them of exactly how out of balance they are and therefore how to get back. And the ones that we understand well, we have work to do. That's how I think about it. And by the way, one of the two, I won't say most important, but most prominent are climate, back to the idea of we've been working on this, and biodiversity. So I think we're working on the right stuff, but we can't assume that we're done if we address those couple of issues. Now, the other thing that we learned when we've looked into this is, well, who is responsible? Or what industries have the greatest impact? And I use the wrong word. It is what industries are closest to each of the planetary boundaries, not who's responsible, because we are all responsible. But what you'll see here is, for example, in a lot of biodiversity loss or water use, et cetera, the agriculture industry is the one that has the broadest impact. But that's not just to say, let's go yell at farmers. That's not going to solve our problem. We have to realize that that's the front end of a broader system, for example. But what we do know is certain industries have certain levels of impact across those boundaries, and therefore, as companies think about what they should do about it, they also can say, okay, we know which of the boundaries we have the biggest impact on, and therefore, what should we be working on? Because it's unrealistic to say to everyone to work on everything. There we go. Now, years ago, my colleague Thomas, who was here somewhere, we I would say, spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to address carbon. And we built these marginal abatement cost curves on carbon. And I think that was a useful framing for folks to say, well, what should we do? As an individual company, as a government, as any actor, it gave you a bit of a playbook to say, the stuff that's going downward on the left, okay, those are things that have an NPV positive or ROI positive positioning today based on existing technology. And the stuff on the right, we may want to do some of that, but it also means there's a technology opportunity. Now, similarly, we've been working very hard over the last year to try to do the same thing with respect not just to carbon, but to other forms of natural capital and planetary boundaries. And what you'll see is similar. Many of the same levers that apply to carbon actually will apply to other planetary boundaries and come from similar industries, but not all. And I would also suggest, while what I'm excited about is we found a number of levers that are already ROI positive today. And so, for example, if we can figure out low-cost power decarbonization, and we already have a path on that, that actually has positive impact not just on carbon, but on water. So I'll give that as a very clear example. When we replace a coal or natural gas fired power plant with wind and solar, yes, of course there's the carbon savings. But as it so happens, wind and solar use a lot less water than a natural gas plant or a coal plant. And so you're addressing a couple boundaries at once. Similarly, in many of the agricultural levers, if we can figure out how to do a regenerative system that may have a minor carbon impact, it will restore the soil and it will save water. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I will encourage you all to, if you just Google, we were going to put a fancy QR code up, but our 172-page report is out. The easiest way to find it is to Google Nature and the Balance and McKinsey, and I promise you'll find it. And we'll also I'm happy to give you a copy too. But we won't go through all these today. But the idea is, if we can work on these various levers, it will get us back into balance on those planetary boundaries that we need to, or we will not have a planet that we're happy to live on. I'm going to just keep us going because I know we don't have a ton of time. But you can see what we did was we did these curves against 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries. And so we looked at how each lever could impact those. So it does give you a bit of a guide on what are some of the things that a corporate actor could take, or an investor or otherwise, that address multiple planetary boundaries, even frankly before we have market pricing on elements other than carbon. And then the other thing I'll just highlight, there we go. And I think we've covered most of this. We know there are ROI positive opportunities. This means there are businesses that can be built to address them and capitalize them. We know that if you do it well as a company, this can be a competitive advantage. And I think Jonathan, when he joins us, will talk a little bit about how some of their actions, and I'm not going to steal your thunder, but how their actions have proven a competitive advantage in actions. And then the other piece of this that I think the investors have started to think about more than others, and we learned this from climate, is not addressing nature crises or nature in your supply chain actually poses business risk. And so as you think about, it's not just can we capitalize on the opportunities, which we should, but it's a recognition of your impact on nature also means a recognition of the risks that you face as nature evolves. So I'm going to skip this. I would just say that the good news here too, similarly how we've gotten to on carbon, they're starting to form what looks like a playbook, and I have the pleasure of staring at where it says nature positive by 2030 over there in very large text. And I think that what that means is we have a playbook for what companies can do to achieve that vision, whether it's 2030 or what your year is and how you frame it. But we're starting to coalesce with folks, stakeholders for companies and others, to understand what that can look like. And I think I'd like to continue that conversation because I think we're all still learning that together, but we at least now have a frame of how to get there. So I'm going to hand over the stage to Duko, who's going to talk about what we're seeing at the country level, because that's the twin to this. There's the corporate action, and then there's what we're going to have to do very specifically in countries on land. Good?
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. And thank you to the GEF for hosting us here. So I'm Duko Hopman, also a partner at McKinsey. So what you just saw, like Josh said, was a detailed perspective on what companies can do on the topic of nature, what action companies can take on the topic of nature. And as far as we know, this is really the first attempt to try and pull together all the known actions, the known levers that companies can take action on, all the levers that are out there in scientific literature or that we uncovered by interviewing experts, etc., and sizing that and understanding how far corporate action can take us to close the gaps to those planetary boundaries. And I think it's been a useful exercise. It showed us that companies can close the gap significantly, but it also shows us that they can't close the gap entirely. And I think the planetary boundary on biodiversity is a good example of that, where companies can kind of get us back to where we were in the 1970s or so, a very significant part of the way there. But there's a big gap remaining. And I think one core other area of action that companies still have a significant but not leading role on is nature conservation. And specifically the target that is under negotiation right now. I think today actually the topic of 30 by 30 that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So the target to protect 30% of land and oceans by 2030 globally. And we are particularly excited about this when we've done some research that shows that outside in, it looks like achieving 30 by 30 would reduce atmospheric CO2 by 2.66 gigatons, but it would also create or sustain about 30 million jobs and $500 billion in GDP, and expand habitat range, protected habitat range of threatened species by something like 2.8x. Right? So a lot of reasons to take action on this topic. But while we see, I think we may be showing this in the green right now. I think we're at the point in the COP that everyone is feeling a little bit less optimistic. Hopefully it'll start to feel more green over the next couple of days. But I would still say there's significant political will behind this target, and financing is slowly coming together as well. But one thing that is somewhat missing is the actual support to governments to get this done, to get 30 by 30 done in a meaningful way. And it's not an easy thing to implement. Right? There's a lot of questions that need to be addressed under that large banner of 30 by 30, of how do you engage indigenous peoples in a meaningful way? How do you think of this in terms of trade-offs with your agricultural output? How do you finance this? How do you actually execute on all these different implementations that would build up to 30 by 30? And increasingly, 30 by 30 needs to be implemented in a trade-off or in a context of very legitimate competing spatial targets around, for example, renewables and agricultural output and population growth and resource extraction and the NDCs and other targets that are very synergetic but not entirely overlapping with 30 by 30. And we know, we've all heard a lot this week about the co-benefits of taking action on nature, but that also means that if there's so much that you can achieve with nature conservation around climate mitigation and mental health and job creation, etc., that also means that you need to make decisions in how you design 30 by 30 in a jurisdiction to optimize for all those different targets. So to illustrate that last point of there's a lot you can achieve, but doing it right and not doing it right, there could be a huge gap between that. We've actually run some analytics on Chile, just randomly chosen as a jurisdiction to deep dive a little bit on this topic. And we kind of ran the two scenarios of achieving 30 by 30 in the easiest or the cheapest way, basically protecting those lands that are least under threat or where the opportunity costs are lowest. And these are the scenarios that do tend to play out quite often in conservation, right? That the lands that are easiest and cheapest to conserve are the ones that are conserved the soonest. But then we've contrasted that with a scenario of kind of optimized achievement of 30 by 30. Optimized for job creation, for species protection, for climate. And the difference is gigantic. Right? You see in the blue here, you see the optimized scenario. This is the current scenario, and this is the opportunistic or the easy scenario. And the difference is literally thousands and thousands of jobs, and this is just the direct jobs in conservation itself. So you can multiply this with 20 or 30 if you think of kind of secondary jobs in tourism, etc. And it could make a difference of hundreds of millions of dollars in GDP, which easily, by the way, finance the 30 by 30 topic in many of these jurisdictions. So again, the difference between doing this right and doing this in an easier way is absolutely enormous in terms of socioeconomic and species and climate benefits to the country. Oh, sorry. So in order to help countries to do this right, we are planning to support 20 countries in the Global South with what we're calling transformation programs, 30 by 30 transformations, borrowing from methodologies of the thousands of transformation programs that we've run in the private sector and hundreds that we've run in the public sector to achieve other targets. So this is a very scripted, I won't take you through all the details here, but it's a very scripted approach of a multi-year process to identify, bottom up, all the initiatives that would lead to 30 by 30, identify what the targets should and are in the country and civil society to achieve with 30 by 30, and then building the infrastructure, the organizational infrastructure, the dashboards, etc., to actually get this implemented. And like I said, it's a very much a bottom-up process that we've started to run now in a Latin American country as kind of the first of those 20 countries to support on this topic. And what you see is that I think typically in a country to achieve 30 by 30, you would want to implement somewhere in the order of magnitude of several hundred initiatives, not just a couple of spatial initiatives of net new protection or new protected areas, but legislative initiatives to build the frameworks to support this, budgetary initiatives, new financial mechanisms, etc. And you can imagine that for many countries, and especially countries in the Global South, implementing such a complex collection of initiatives is not going to be an easy task. So that is where we try to come in with partner NGOs to support them with the right analytics and dashboards, the right organizational support, the right kind of the methodological way of advancing initiatives through the pipeline, and a very high-paced and scripted meeting cadence to get this done. So anyway, I just wanted to have that on your radar, especially in case you're representing a Global South country. Please come talk to us. We'd love to support you on this topic, and we're working on this together with the Moore Foundation and the Zoma Foundation and several other partners on this topic. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Caroline now to take us through the even more interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Duko and Josh, for this for setting the stage for the discussion we're going to have here with Jonathan. There will be an opportunity. Can you hear me well? Just okay. We're going to have an opportunity after the discussion for the audience to ask a question about the presentation and also direct any question to Mr. Price. Before doing so, I want to introduce Jonathan Price, who is with us today. Thank you very much, Jonathan. You are the Chief Executive Officer of TEC since June. And also, you've been a member of the Board of Directors since July 2022. You joined TEC in October 2020 and held several executive positions, Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, bringing your expertise and experience across the resources sector through a variety of finance, commercial, business development roles in Europe, in Asia, and also in Australia. Prior to joining TEC, you also held a series of executive positions at BHP, also in different countries, and you also worked in the metals and mining team at EBN AMRO Bank, and also you worked for Inco. And finally, you hold a Master of Engineering in Metallurgy and Material Science from the University of Oxford and an MBA from Cardiff University. Thank you very much again for being with us today. I'm very excited about the discussion we're going to have, especially since TEC has taken a nature positive commitment. I think that was last June. And before asking you some specific question around that commitment, I wanted to get your overall impression attending COP15 and also on enabling conditions to pursue a nature positive agenda.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline, and thank you everyone for attending the discussion today. It's great for us at TEC Resources to be part of this conversation and, of course, to be part of COP15 generally. We, like all of you, recognise that nature loss is a major global challenge. the World Economic Forum ranks biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse as one of the top threats that humanity will face this decade. And nature, of course, is foundational for the global economy. Over half of the world's GDP, which is estimated at around $44 trillion, depends moderately or highly on nature. So halting or reverting nature loss is clearly very important, but it requires a truly collective effort. The private sector, of course, and business has a role to play in that, but critically government and non-government organizations need to come together to identify the solutions and work on delivering those, and that's why I and the team from Tech are here at COP15 this week. We also want to ensure that we share Tech's own nature positive commitment that you mentioned, to be nature positive by 2030, and talk about why we've done that and what that means in some detail, and then engage with others on that, because we need help to achieve that, and we believe we can help others through the experience that we will gain in our business context. We already, of course, work with a range of stakeholders through our business activities, whether that be our communities, governments, indigenous peoples. What we're doing now, of course, is extending those partnerships and extending our work with those stakeholders into the area of nature. So I know you have a number of questions, Caroline, so very happy to jump into those.
The first one is actually about the nature positive target that you set for 2030. I'm curious to know about what has compelled Tech to take that commitment in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we start from a perspective of doing the right thing, if you like. So we recognize that from an environmental perspective, this is required, but also from an economic perspective, that this is going to be core to good business, as we've just heard. For us specifically, in our industry, our ability to continue operating is increasingly linked to how we can responsibly manage the impacts of our operations and therefore contribute to solving global issues like nature loss and like climate change, of course. That's why we set the goal as a company to become nature positive by 2030, which for us includes a commitment to conserve or rehabilitate at least 3 hectares for every 1 hectare of land that we disturb through our own activities. We felt it was important to set this target for 3 reasons. First, because we recognize the global need to halt and reverse nature loss, and we want to make a meaningful contribution to that. Secondly, because the world can't meet its net zero climate goals without the products that we produce and in the supply of critical minerals, and for us in particular, copper. But we know we need to produce those minerals with the smallest possible environmental footprint and the smallest possible impact on nature. And third, we made this commitment because we wanted to help lead other companies in our industry to do the same and to make similar commitments to being nature positive, some of which, of course, we achieve through the International Council on Mining and Metals. Josh made a point in his presentation around competitive advantage, and I think that's a very relevant one here. I think increasingly in business, responsible actors will have preferential access to good business opportunities in the future. Secondly, I think being active on dealing with issues related to biodiversity and nature is connected to supply chain resilience. The sorts of things that can disrupt operations can be better managed through making the right investments early. So I fully agree with the point that there's a competitive advantage angle to this as well.
Josh also mentioned that for the past 10 years we've been working on climate change. I think Tech also has a net zero goal by 2050. I'm curious to ask you about your, drawing on our collective experience from decarbonization and your own also experience working in different countries. What enabling environment is actually required for business to pursue a nature positive agenda?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things we can learn from the work on climate change. I think the key one is that if we're going to halt and reverse nature loss, much like action on climate change, it requires a collective response. So again, private sector, governments, communities, indigenous peoples, etc., need to work collectively on addressing this issue. As I mentioned, nature is so foundational to the global economy. $44 trillion at risk if we can't address the issues that we're talking about today. And the private sector can set goals and mobilize investments, as tech is doing, and we'll talk about some more, I'm sure, through this discussion. But we need to find ways for the private sector to be able to scale those investments over and above the commitments that we're seeing being made today. And one of the key challenges that we find and others in the sector find is it's hard to put traditional financial metrics against investments, the sort of metrics like an internal rate of return or a net present value that we're so familiar to using if we were replacing some of our commitments, some of our equipment, or we were investing in a new operation. Are difficult to apply sometimes with some of the nature commitments that are required. And sometimes that's because it's difficult to contemplate how we would directly realize a cost saving or how we might create new economic value through the sale of a new product. It was good to see, again, the work that was presented here around the ROI curves and that there is work being done to help the private sector justify those sorts of investments. But I think we need to see more of that, and we need more consistency in the way that those can be applied to the way that capital is put to work. Currently, in the absence of that sort of ROI justification, we typically talk about risk mitigation, or we talk about doing the right thing, which of course you can imagine from time to time causes some challenging conversations with our own investors as they look for a return on the capital that they provide to us. So look, I think there's a lot we can learn from decarbonisation here. We talk internally about the potential for something like biodiversity credits in the way that you have carbon credits, which we've seen being a key lever for investment in that industry, and it provides a real economic signal to drive increased investment from the private sector, which I think we're all keen to achieve.
You mentioned the complexity of metrics. Curious to ask you if you think that reporting standards or mandatory targets, subsidies will actually be necessary to overcome the inertia to gather momentum. And curious to see if any of those have played any role in your own nature commitments.
Yeah, I think in short the answer to that is yes. Tech's been reporting on biodiversity since 2002. And we are committed to continuing detailed and transparent reporting with respect to biodiversity in nature. And as such, we will pilot the TNFD framework in 2023. Reporting standards and targets across jurisdictions can certainly play a role in supporting broader action across the industry. And we're supportive of mandatory requirements for large and transnational corporations and financial institutions to address and disclose their impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. But consistency here and a level playing field again across national boundaries is going to be very important. But at the same time, from Tech's perspective, we didn't want to wait while that was being debated and while frameworks are being finalized. We still think that a bias to action is better, which is why we've started on this some time ago, and we're moving forward. As the standards catch up, then we will look at what we consider to be the right ones to apply, and hope that takes on in a broader international sense.
If you allow me, I just want to go off script for one question. You mentioned the broader industry and momentum within the industry. What has been the reaction to your own nature commitments from the mining industry?
Look, I think there's generally an increasing recognition that this is an area where there's a crisis ahead of us, and where we as an industry need to act in the same way we've acted with climate change. From Tech's perspective, we wanted to get out in front of this. We've seen a number of other mining companies, including some of the largest mining companies globally, now making their own nature positive commitments, which is very encouraging. And this is now a high priority item for the International Council of Mining and Metals, and something that group will invest a great deal of time on in 2023. So I think it's well recognized as a critical issue, somewhere where we can play a direct role and contribute beyond the boundaries of our own operations to addressing solutions here. But the industry, I see, is gathering momentum now, and as I said, look forward to carrying that into 2023.
Understood. And maybe thinking of other sectors, in which sectors do you see Do you think we will see like first movers in a scalable nature-based solution?
Look, I mean, I think it's hard to sort of outline any specific sectors here. I think, as you'll see from the events and the discussions here, various actors across all sectors of business are now taking a more active role with respect to nature. I think the key thing is that we need to get that sense of urgency. As I said, I think the bias for action here is very, very important. We shouldn't wait for frameworks and targets to be established externally, and I think that's true of all areas. And tech took the decision to move ahead with a commitment to nature positive before there being a global definition of what that meant. But we recognise the need to do better and the need to take industry with us. So we're moving as quickly as we can in that regard. We also, as I mentioned, have to offset this or balance this against the fact that the products that we produce, the metals and the minerals, are going to be critical for delivering against climate goals. So there's this convergence of climate and nature here that exists very much within our own business, but I think more broadly in the way that various sectors will think about motivating the investments they need to make.
And you were mentioning at the beginning your commitment to conserve or rehabilitate 3 hectares of land for 1 hectare affected by your own operation. Can you discuss the type of solution that you're going to implement to reach that commitment?
Yeah, so we have a broad range of commitments that we're taking here to act on nature. As well as conserving additional areas of nature through partnerships with conservation organisations and indigenous peoples. We're also accelerating the rate of rehabilitation associated with our own mines and operations as we move towards 2030. A number of things we've done of late. Earlier this year, we announced conservation investments of over $25 million to protect 14,000 hectares of land. That's equal to over 40% of our own mining footprint as it stands today, which is the equivalent of 40 Central Parks in New York, or for those watching the World Cup soccer, 20,000 football fields. That seems to be the metric that resonates with most people at the moment. We heard before about some examples of work being done on Chile. There's some very good work that Teck has been doing there. Our single largest investment has been the construction of a desalination plant in Chile, which is to provide the water that's needed for our own flagship QB2 copper project in the country, which comes online next year. That desalination plant completely eliminates the need for us to access groundwater to supply the water that we need for our own operations, and that facility will be entirely powered through renewably sourced electricity. And then further, just building on the QB2 project analogy here, following consultation with local communities, with indigenous peoples and regulators at the design phase of the project, we actually amended the design in various areas to protect critical flora and fauna. This ultimately increased the construction cost of the project for Teck, but entirely consistent again with making investments and having a determination to bring on the minerals that the world needs, but to do so while minimizing the impact to nature and biodiversity.
You mentioned partnerships, working with indigenous people and local communities. Can you tell us a bit more about how you actually engage with stakeholders to make those conservation investments into 40,000 hectares?
Yeah, so of course we've been engaging with communities, indigenous peoples, local governments for decades around the operations where we're active, but we do that now as well with a specific focus on nature and the investments that can be made in nature. We've established a tremendous partnership with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. They share our belief that it will take a combination of for-profit and non-profit organizations to come together to tackle the challenge of nature loss. Earlier this year, we announced the purchase and ongoing management of nearly 8,000 hectares in the East Kootenays of British Columbia through the Nature Conservancy of Canada. We also donated 162 hectares of our own land near Kimberley, British Columbia. Again, we donated that to the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And we announced the permanent protection of nearly 6,000 hectares of unique and high-valued wetland ecosystem, which, as we've seen, is under particular threat. That's near our QB operations in Chile, and we've done that in partnership with local indigenous communities. And of course, we partner with our indigenous communities in Canada. A good example being the Tunaha Nation, whose territory that we operate on. We purchased and are conserving over 7,000 hectares of private lands for protection in the Elk Valley and the Flathead River valleys of British Columbia, again to ensure social, cultural and environmental value. And we've put together an agreement where we will jointly manage those lands in perpetuity.
I may have lost. Back. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think we have a few minutes now, maybe to open to the audience for any question, either to Jonathan or to the presenters, Josh and Duko, about the presentation. Actually, may I invite Duko and Josh back on the stage? Any question or comment from the audience?
Jonathan, since I have the microphone, quick question on your 3-to-1 offsets. How do you choose specifically where you do those offsets? Is there a methodology, and do you try and match it in the specific region, country?
I mean, I think local is always the preference there, because a lot of this is related to local community utility as well as the lands that are important to the indigenous peoples in those areas. In some cases, though, what we're looking for is comparable land or comparable land use before and after, and if that can't be achieved locally, then we would look regionally or further afield. But it's assessed on a case-by-case basis.
Just one from my side, which is, I think you're among the enlightened. So can you help just a little bit of what would you say, and what are you saying to other CEOs in this space to help them understand the value of this journey that it's been for you guys? So just share a little bit about that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to explain to them why we've made the commitment we have, what that means in practice, and the tangible actions we're taking. But critically, when we speak to others in our industry or beyond, we're trying to convey to them why this is good business sense, why these investments ultimately will make our company more sustainable, will make our operations more resilient, will create greater partnerships and acceptance for the communities that we're working with. And I think when business starts to see this as an essential part of good business rather than something we should be doing on the side to create a perception of being a good operator, then there'll be more and more interest. And I think that's a theme that's rapidly gaining traction here. Of course, we'd like to see more urgency and an acceleration in the adoption of similar targets and similar commitments by other players.
Yeah, also a very similar question to you again, but more focusing on your own company. What was changed already for the employees? Because I can imagine working in a company, it's also difficult to hire people, and this aspect to work for a company which is behaving good is also an advantage. Could you see this already, or is it in the moment only cost and money which goes away from you?
I think that's a great question, and it goes to that point of competitive advantage again. There's a huge talent attraction here through companies that do the right thing. I mean, firstly, we're focused on providing critical minerals that the world needs to decarbonize. That in and of itself is very attractive to potential and prospective employees. Secondly, the commitments we've made on climate change, similarly, were demonstration of us wanting to do the right thing and recognizing the critical business need to engage in that. Nature is a further example of that, I believe, and we have a purpose statement that actually talks about the land that we love, which is unusual language for a mining company, I think, to use in that regard, but it's something that gets noticed externally to the organization in terms of the commitment that we're making to really invest in these things and make it a core part of how we work. So we don't just focus on what we do, but how we do things has equal prominence. And we certainly see that as very important to talent attraction and talent retention in an increasingly competitive marketplace. And it's something I think, as I said, that can be a competitive advantage for tech. So it's a great question and perhaps something we collectively don't talk about enough. Sorry, I would just add to that one additional point. From time to time, we meet people in the organization who had previously worked for NGOs or consultants who've come to tech because they believe they can make more impact inside the company working on these issues. So perhaps having sat outside lobbying industry previously, they recognize that when you find a company with the intention to do the right thing, they can have a direct positive impact on addressing change. So I think that further goes to the question you asked.
Yeah, thank you for your leadership on this topic, and clearly you're ahead of the parade compared to other companies taking a nature positive target. But in the process leading to adopting such target, I'm curious to see what role your investors had to play. You're a public company, so curious to see how your main investors are discussing with you about these topics, or whether it was an independent decision trying to sort of see the future before it comes to you, and if you had any advice also for companies who might be struggling with investor requests to that effect.
Yeah, so this wasn't done as a direct response to investor pressure or direct requests for action in this area for our investors, but our investors like the fact that tech has a very long track record of being a good operator and a focus on sustainability. I mean, it's worth mentioning that tech's published a sustainability report for more than 20 years now, so this is not sort of a new fad for our organization. It's been deeply embedded in the DNA of tech for some time. We have made very strong commitments in recent years in the area of climate change and decarbonization, and nature for us we recognized as being the next frontier that required bold action and required collective action, not just from tech but from industry more generally. So our investors weren't directly consulted as part of making this decision, but we took the view that it's entirely consistent with how tech has acted over many decades now, and was just a further evolution of that. Of course, it's something we now talk to our investors about. They're supportive, again, of tech being on the front foot in these areas. Of course, they'll ask us about how much capital we plan to invest in this and what sort of return we expect to get from that capital. But generally speaking, they recognize that being a good player in business over a long period of time is more likely to create sustainable shareholder returns, and that's how we engage and how we present with them.
Great, and it's me again. Now it's a question for the first presentation from McKinsey. Great report, I downloaded it, I will have a look to it, that's for sure. But on the other hand, when I listened to you, it came into my mind that there are of course also other companies existing as McKinsey, PricewaterhouseCoopers and some others. And wouldn't it make sense, so the question is, will they also come up with such a report and they call it then 50 times 50 or 30 times 30 or... So therefore, wouldn't it make sense to also work together and come up with a joint report of this specific companies, which goes, of course, also have the chance to advise other companies what to do, or will we have to deal with all these different single reportings?
Yeah, thank you. No, I completely agree that it would make a lot of sense for them to just adopt our frameworks and methodologies. So they're no, but I think that's it's something we specifically tried to avoid in how we chose to approach both the Nature and the Balance report, which is what my colleague Josh spoke about the actions that companies can take on this, and then also our approach to the 30 by 30, the action that government can lead on. We didn't invent our own frameworks here for that specific reason, because I don't think it's helpful to have a proliferation of different ways of thinking about this and vocabularies and methods and frameworks. I think that's one of the lack of standardization may in fact have been one of the reasons why companies have been slow to take action on the topic of nature. So the planetary boundaries framework was one that was, I think, originally designed by the Stockholm Resilience Center, and we found it to be a very helpful framework to look through and to think through this topic and think through what impact actions could have. So we didn't invent our own. We think that this is a good one. I'm sure there are other ways to achieve the same thing, but I agree with you that it's going to be unhelpful to have dozens of them out there. And 30 by 30 is the same thing. I wish I could claim credit for such a great movement, but it's one that started long before we got engaged on this topic, and is one that is actually led by the CBD and the High Ambition of the High Ambition Coalition for nature and people. And again, not trying to reinvent any wheels there for sure. Yeah. Jan. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Pippa Howard. Really great presentation. I just have a question for McKinsey. It's fantastic that the organization is picking up on this topic so rapidly and putting so many resources to it. It's kind of been the sort of haven of the NGOs. I've come from an NGO. I've moved into a new. I'm with Nature Metrics now, but and was with Fauna and Flora International for 15 years. So it's become mainstream, hasn't it? So it's incredible to see the big management consultancies now talking the language that the NGOs are. Can I just ask a question on how, and if you do partner with the conservation, nature, civil society organizations in the work that you do, learning from the work that we've done over 20 years? So it would be great to see how that conversation can help to continue the work that you're doing, but also to continue the work that they're doing too.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We are partnering very closely with the NGOs on this topic because I think we do recognize that we have a lot to learn here, and we try to soak it all up and try to catch up with the decades of knowledge and science that has been built up on this topic. So specifically, for example, we're working with the Enduring Earth coalition of NGOs in which WWF and TNC and Pew and the Zoma Foundation are leaders, and the Blue Nature Alliance in which Conservation International and Pew are leaders, and working on these very topics, trying to engage them in science-based conversations around, for example, this report and how to achieve 30 by 30, and also on specific other topics. Actually, I had a question maybe for you, Jonathan. You mentioned biodiversity credits, which is a particularly intriguing topic, I think, for us and for many. I think there was a session on this topic yesterday or on Sunday, and we couldn't fit people in the room. Can you say a little bit more about what you're doing on that front and what you're hoping to achieve there?
You've played that very well by answering your question by asking me a question. Look, we don't have a specific solution for that. I think it's recognition of the fact we would like to see sort of instruments and tools developed that would give a sort of a signal for investment by the business community. I think that could be one of a whole range of solutions that could be implemented. I don't think it's for individual companies to sort of identify what those mechanisms would look like. We'd like to be part of the conversation, but this is where government, I think, has a critical role to play in creating that investment signal for others. So McKinsey might have a point of view on this, but I'll pass you the microphone back and you can talk about it if you like.
Yeah, and then I'll pass the invitation back to you to be part of that conversation. We're actually working with Vera. I see Sinclair here in the audience and other organizations of trying to figure out what biodiversity credits or nature credits might look like. But it would be very helpful to have the demand side or the corporate side very engaged on that dialogue throughout. So yes, open invitation for sure. Let me pass it back to Caroline then, is that right?
Any other question from the audience? Otherwise, I'm going to invite Carter Roberts from WWF US. Why don't you sit here and I'm going to sit here?
Sit here
Yeah.
in this
Okay.
chair. I'm fine.
Good. Thank you so much, Carter, for being with us. We've been offering you the opportunity to actually do the closing remarks of this event. So,
Thanks so much. I wanted to thank you all for giving me this spot, but also just to say we have been working at WWF and also in this coalition with TNC and Pew and Zomalab and many others with McKinsey in many, many different areas. And their rigor, their science, but really the most important thing is the business case for nature. Too often we talk about the science. We ring the bell on the science, but we don't make the business case in a way that is palpable and that really guides actions and also informs the commitments of governments. So as we're working through 30 by 30 in different governments, there's a moment when you sit down with a head of state, you talk about nature, you talk about 30 by 30, you talk about the rest, but at the end of the day, what we do has to create jobs. It is not enough to create park systems. You also have to make sure that local communities, indigenous communities, that their rights are respected, that we follow their lead, but at the end of the day, there is real economic benefit. And I've been in this field for 30 years, starting off with the Nature Conservancy, now at WWF for 18 years. We do not do a good enough job making the economic case, the jobs case. We know it in our bones. You wouldn't be here if we didn't acknowledge that nature was fundamental to not the future of the planet, but our future. I would say that the climate COP has traditionally been stronger. The blue zone is bigger. But I'm telling you, what we are seeing at WWF is the world is waking up. Businesses are waking up. The biggest businesses we work with, whether it's Walmart or McDonald's or HP or Mars, they are now incorporating nature into their plans. Science-based targets are great, but I would say for next steps with companies is side by side with your climate commitment and drilling down in your own operations. You can easily do the same with nature. You know your supply chains, you know where you operate. It is easy to put numbers and priorities behind making a difference on nature and owning the impact you have on nature. The most progressive companies we see are doing that right now. And it's not as complex as people think. And there are huge opportunities for companies to distinguish themselves on this front. So I wanted to thank McKinsey for all the work that they've been doing. It's true the Enduring Earth Coalition is working with 25 countries around the world to move ahead on this front. And if you're interested in learning more about that work, we invite you to contact us anytime you want. So, Duko, back over to you. Thank you for the moment to speak.
Yeah, and thank you very much. So, Carter Roberts, CEO of WWF US, and yeah, thank you for all these years of friendship and partnership on these difficult topics. So thank you. And thanks again to the GEF for hosting us here, and to all of you for showing up. Thank you.